Welcome to this YSL Microsoft Excel tutorial. In this video we're going to cover how to use the filter function. We'll start with the basics of applying simple filters, returning the list of filtered results to a separate worksheet, and how to deal with no matches. We'll then look at employing aggregate and rank functions so that you can find the top and bottom items in a list, and also show you how you can find duplicate and unique values in a list. We'll explain how to write criteria involving dates and involving text, including how to find wildcard patterns, such as begins with, ends with, and contains text. We'll look at how to combine conditions using and or operators, and then for the final part of the video, how to create a simple user interface to use cells in the worksheet to provide the criteria for the filter function. So quite a lot to do in this one. Let's get started. For this video, we'll be using a list of the top 50 highest grossing movies. If you'd like a copy of the same data to work with so that you can follow along with the video, you'll find a link in the description that you can use to download the same file that I'm working on here. So the job of the filter function is to return a filtered list of values, either from a single column or a single row, or even from an entire table. So all the examples we're going to create in this video will be returning different rows from this table. The filter function allows you to do similar things in principle to those you can do with the auto filter feature. So for example, I could enable the auto filter on this table and then filter the list in place to see the results I was interested in. The big advantage of the filter function is that it allows us to extract the filtered results very easily into different locations in the workbook. One thing that will help us a lot when we're writing our filter conditions is if we have convenient ways to reference both the entire table of data and also the individual columns in it. We've got a couple of choices for how we can do that, but for this video I'm going to create some named ranges to reference the various sets of information I'm interested in. So first of all, I'm going to create a named range that refers to all of the data excluding the column headers. So I'm going to start by selecting cell A3 on the top 50 movie sheet, hold down Ctrl-Shift, tap the right arrow key to expand my selection across to the last column, and then Ctrl and Shift and tap the down arrow key to expand the selection down to the bottom row. Then I'm going to click into the name box in the top left hand corner, and I'm going to type in a named range. I'm going to call this one movie list. No spaces, no punctuation characters, just stick to text and numbers for your range names, and then hit enter to create them. Next, I'm going to do the same sort of thing, but I'm going to create a separate range name for each individual column of values. So I'm going to start by selecting cell A2, hold Ctrl-Shift, tap the right arrow key, tap the down arrow key. So I've highlighted all the data, including the column headers this time. And then one easy way to do this is to head to the Formulas tab in the ribbon and choose Create from Selection. There's also a keyboard shortcut we could use there as well. If I choose Create from Selection, I want to make sure I'm using the values in just the top row of my selection, and if I then click OK, I'll have created a new named range for each separate column. Just to quickly check that, we can have a look in the Name Manager tool just to make sure that our named ranges now exist, and we can see what cells they reference and what values they contain. And you can also check the same thing looking in the name box in the top left-hand corner of your worksheet. So selecting a single named range there will highlight all of the cells that that named range corresponds to. Having done that, I would now like to write our very first example of the filter function. I'm going to do that on a separate worksheet, on this filter sheet. All I've done here is really just copied the column headers across from the top 50 movies worksheet. In cell A3, I'm going to begin a new formula by saying equals and then reference the filter function. It's an incredibly simple function in terms of how powerful it is. There's only two compulsory parameters here. So the first one is the list of values that we want to filter. So that's our movie list, followed by an include parameter, which is basically a logical test. If you're familiar with writing if functions, the very first thing you do in an if function is write a logical test to determine whether something is true or not. And it's the same basic idea here. So I want to return from my movie list. Let's say we want to return all the films that have won at least one Oscar. So I can refer to my Oscar wins column using my Oscar wins named range and then simply ask if that is greater than 0. I can then close the round brackets and hit enter, and the filter function effectively copies all the values from the main list which match my filter condition and display them to me in a dynamic spilled array. The filter function always returns a spilled array, and if you're not familiar with how those work, we do have a separate video which explains spilled array formulas. So if you need a bit of a primer on how spilled arrays work, that's a nice place to start. But there we go, our very first basic example of the filter function. When you're writing conditions for the filter function, it's quite possible that none of the values in the original list meet the criteria you've specified. So just to demonstrate that, let's try to return all the films that have won more than 20 Oscars. If I head back to cell A3 and then I'm going to hit the F2 key to edit the formula in that cell, then I'm just going to modify my condition to say greater than 20 rather than greater than 0. The default action applied when the filter function returns no results is to return the #calc error. We've got several ways we could handle that, but there's actually a built-in parameter of the filter function that lets us do this very easily. We can replace the #calc error message with a slightly more user-friendly message instead. So let's edit the formula in cell A3 again, and then if I click just inside the round brackets, we're going to specify a value for the ifEmpty parameter. So I'll add a comma after my include condition, and then in some double quotes, just say something simple like no results. And then if I hit enter at this point, I'll find I get a nice user-friendly error message rather than the horrible one that I saw earlier on. I'm just going to change that condition then back to showing films that have won at least one Oscar. So let's edit the formula one more time to go back to Oscar wins greater than 0, and then we'll return a sensible list of results. As well as using constant values for your criteria, like the number 0 that we've written for this example, you can also calculate values for your criteria. So let's say, for example, we wanted to return all the films whose Oscar wins is equal to the maximum value of the Oscar wins column. If we modify the value or the formula in cell A3, I can change my condition so that it says Oscar wins equals, and then I can nest to the max function inside my condition. And then inside the max function, I can reference my Oscar wins column again. Then just close the round brackets. So any film whose Oscar wins value is equal to the biggest number in the Oscar wins column will now be returned in the results. So 2 films matching the maximum value of Oscar wins. We could do something similar. Let's say we wanted to return the longest film in the list. If we head back to cell A3 and then edit the formula again, this time I'm going to modify the condition so that we're looking at the runtime column, and then looking for the film or films potentially whose runtime is equal to the maximum of the runtime. So I hit enter at this point, I'll return the one single film with the biggest runtime minutes. You can use other aggregate functions as well in a similar way. So let's say we wanted to show all the films that are longer than average in our list. If we head back to cell A3, we can just modify the functions we're using and the comparison operators. So let's say I want to find all the films whose runtime is greater than, and then not the maximum runtime. There can't possibly be any films whose runtime is longer than the maximum runtime, but I want to find all the films whose runtime is longer than the average runtime instead. So having done that, we can enter the formula, and there we go. We end up with, what do we get there? About 25 films who are longer than average. We can write slightly more complex conditions to return the top or bottom items in a list. So for example, in this case, if we wanted to return the top 5 highest grossing films, that's nice and easy because we've already got a rank column which describes the position of each film according to its box office takings. So if we modify the value in cell A3 again, and let's return a list of all the films where the value of the rank column is less than or equal to 5. So there we go, the top 5 highest grossing films. To do the same thing, let's say we wanted to find the top 5 longest films in the list. To do that, we'd have to calculate the rank of the runtime values. Unfortunately, Excel has a couple of functions that allow you to calculate a rank for a set of values. So what we're going to do is head back to cell A3 again, and this time we're going to change the reference to the rank column to a reference to the rank functions. There are 2 different ones available there, rank AVG and rank EQ. The difference is in what value gets returned when, say, 2 films had the exact same runtime in minutes. The rank AVG would give you the average between, say, 5 and 6. Rank EQ would assign the same value to each film. So we're going to use rank EQ, and then inside that function we're going to reference the runtime column. So I want to rank each runtime value, and I want to rank each runtime against all of the other runtimes in the same column, so we refer to the runtime column twice. Then I can close the round brackets and hit enter, and this time I will return, well, in this case, 6 films, because there are 2 films which had the same runtime for the 5th item in the list. So rank EQ assigns the same value of rank to each of those 2 films. be nice if we could see that list sorted so that the longest film was at the top as well. So we can combine the filter function with some of the other functions we've covered in previous videos. So in this case, let's wrap the sort function around this list. I'm going to edit the formula in cell A3 again. I'm going to assign the sort function, open up some round brackets. So I'm going to sort the results of the entire filter function. I then have to specify which column I'm sorting my list by. So if I count from left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, I want to sort my list by the 4th column. And I want to see the results in descending order as well. So for the 3rd parameter there, I'm going to use the -1 for descending. If you're interested in more details of how the sort function works, then we have a separate video which explains that. But just for now, this simple example will do. To get the same list of results but showing the 5 shortest films, then we can simply adjust how the rank function works. So if I head back to cell A3 one more time and then head into the rank EQ function, so I've said rank the runtime value against all the runtime values. I just want to change the order so that we go in ascending order. So if I hit enter now, we'll find the 5 shortest films in the list sorted in descending order there. So I suppose it would make sense to change the sort order as well, wouldn't it? So that they go upwards. So let's just change the sort order to use the number 1 for ascending rather than descending. So there we go. We could also use the filter function to return duplicate or unique values from a list. So let's say, for example, we wanted to find if there were any duplicate film titles. Let's edit the formula in cell A3 again. I'm just going to start by removing the sort function just to tidy things up a little bit. So I'll get rid of the sort and the open round brackets at the beginning, and then the extra arguments there at the end associated with the sort columns. Then for the include condition, I'm going to get rid of the entire condition using the rank function and replace that with a reference to the countif function instead. So the countif function requires 2 arguments, the range you're looking in. So I'm going to look in the title column of my main list, and then the criteria you want to apply to that range. So the criteria I'm going to apply, slightly confusingly, is the title column again. So I want to look for each individual film title in the entire column of film titles, and then that will tell me how many of each there are. And if the result of that is greater than 1, then I know that there's a duplicate film title in that list. So if I hit enter at this point, I find that The Lion King exists twice in my list. Should I want to do the opposite and find, say, only genres that appear once and once only in my list, so that there is only one example of a film in each genre, then I could modify the formula in cell A3 again, but this time I'm going to count if genre by genre, and I'm going to check if that's equal to 1. So if there is only one instance of each genre, then that film will be returned. So if I hit enter at that point, it turns out there's 1 romance film and 1 musical film in our list. Next, let's look at how to write conditions involving date values. And let's assume for the moment that we wanted to write our date as a constant directly into the formula itself. So I wanted to find, say, all the films released before the 1st of January 2000. The trick to getting this to work is knowing how to write your date in a formula so that Excel interprets it as a valid date. Let's just head back to cell A3. I'm going to modify the formula here, get rid of our current condition in the include parameter, and replace that by referencing the release date field. And let's just try to say where the release date is less than 1/1/2000. The problem with that is that although it looks like a date, and that is indeed how you would write a date in a cell in Excel, if I hit enter, I don't get any result at all. And that's because that thing that looks like a date isn't being interpreted as a date, it's being interpreted as an expression, 1 divided by 1 divided by 2000. And unsurprisingly, there are no films whose release date is before the result of that expression. One thing you might then try to do is try to enter the date as text by wrapping a set of double quotes around it, much like you insert any literal text in a formula in Excel. The problem with that is that although I do now return some results, none of the results seem to have any bearing whatsoever on the condition I've applied. Apparently all of my dates are less than that bit of text that I've entered. And again, that's because that is now being interpreted as a string, not as a date. So the solution to this is to enter your date as a string yes, but to pass that into a function which converts that string into a date value. So I'm going to say release date is less than, and then I'm going to say date value, open up some round brackets, and then close the round brackets at the end of that string. So the job of the date value function is to take some text which looks like a date and convert it into a valid date value. So hitting enter at this point now will indeed return all the films in my list whose release date is before the 1st of Jan 2000. As well as using complete date values, you can also calculate parts of dates using some of the date and time functions. So there are plenty of these available in Excel. From the Formulas tab in the ribbon, you'll find a date and time category, and you can do things like extract the day of the month that a date belongs to, or the month of the year, or the weekday number, or even the year itself. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to find all the films in my list released in the year 2019. To make that work, I can modify the formula in cell A3, and I'm going to change my condition, my include condition. So I'm going to not refer to the entire release date field, I'm going to refer to just the year of the release date. So I'll say year, open up some round brackets, and then close the round brackets after the release date field. I can then change the rest of this condition to ask where that is equal to 2019. And this time I am using just the number 2019. The year function returns a number, so I can compare it directly with another number. So hitting enter at this point, I'll find all the films whose year of release is the year 2019. Next, let's look at some basic comparisons involving text. So let's say, for example, I wanted to return all the films whose genre equals action. If we head back to the formula in cell A3, then we can remove our current condition in the include parameter, refer to the genre column, and then ask where that is equal to the word action. And because we're writing this as literal text, it needs to be inserted in some double quotes. It isn't case sensitive, so it doesn't matter whether I use an uppercase A or a lowercase, it'll still return all the films whose genre is equal to the word action. You can also use other comparison operators, not just equals, when it comes to text. So as an example of that, let's head back to the formula in cell A3. I'm going to edit it this time. I'm going to reference the title field, or attempt to do that. There we go, title. And rather than equals, I'm going to say less than, and then rather than the word action, I'm going to enter the letter D. Now, just to interpret what that's going to do, if you imagine all the film titles sorted alphabetically, what this condition is going to do is return any films in that list that would appear before the letter D. So effectively, I'm returning all the films whose title begins with A, B, or C. I can do a similar thing to find all the films whose title begins with X, Y, or Z. If I edit the formula again and then change this so it's greater than or equal to X, and then hit enter. As it turns out, there's only one film that begins with either X, Y, or Z, and it's Zootopia. A common requirement when working with text filters is to perform more elaborate comparisons, such as begins with, ends with, or contains. But sadly, the filter function by default doesn't support any of those features. All of your text comparisons, at least the basic ones that we've been writing so far, are essentially equal to, or greater than, or less than. So for example, if I edit my formula in cell A3 again, and I try to find all the films whose title equals Lion King, that won't be sufficient to return any results, because there aren't any films whose title exactly matches that. The film with the word Lion King in it is actually called The Lion King. So if I spell the entire word out correctly, I can return the results. But what if I wanted to find films that contain the word king, for example? In order to make that work, we've got to use some text functions, which will allow us to search for one string within another. Just to demonstrate how this is going to work, I'm going to temporarily switch back to the top 50 movies worksheet. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here as well. And I'm going to add a new calculated column in column K. So I'm going to try to search for the word king in the film titles. So to do that, I'm going to use either the search or the find function. The only difference here is that the find function is case sensitive, whereas the search function isn't. So to keep my search criteria as flexible as possible, I'm going to use search, and then I have to enter my find text, which is going to be the word king, and then my within text, which is going to be a reference to the title column. If I then close the round brackets and then hit enter, I will return, for those films whose title does contain the word king, I will get a number representing the position of that word in the film title. So the number 10 here indicates that the word king begins at the 10th character of The Lion King. 24 indicates that the word king appears at the 24th character, and so on. The problem is that any of the films which don't contain the word king return a hash value error, and neither the number nor the hash value error are any good to use as a criterion for our include parameter of the filter function. So what we need to do is convert these values into trues and falses. I want it to say true when I find the word and false when I don't. So a really simple way to achieve that is to wrap the isNumber function around the results of the search function. So if I say in cell K3 here equals isNumber, open up some round brackets, then the entire search function is nested inside there. Then we can close the round brackets. That returns our list of true, false values, which we can use for our filter conditions. So rather than write all that out again, I'm just going to quickly cheat. I'm going to copy that from the formula bar. And then I'm going to head back to the filter page, edit my formula here, and I'm going to replace my current condition with the one that I've just copied. So isNumber search king title. So having done that, I should now return all the films that contain the word king anywhere in their name. Just to demonstrate the difference between find and search, if I head back to cell A3 here, I'm going to change my search to search for the word man, but I'm going to type it in all in lowercase. I'll type in the word man in lowercase and then hit enter. And hopefully you can see here that I'm returning combinations of films with capital M's and lowercase m's. If I head back to this formula and change my search function to the find function, then we'll find if I type in the word man in all lowercase, then I only return those films that contains lowercase man. If I change this so that it's looking for an uppercase letter M, then I'll find only those films that contain an uppercase man. So this technique finds the text we're looking for wherever it exists within the film title. If you want to create something like a begins with or an ends with condition, then we need a slightly different approach. So let's say we wanted to find all the films that begin with the word star. So that's any film whose first 4 characters is STAR. If I edit the formula in cell A3 again, we can remove the entire isNumber and find function combination and replace this with a function called left. So the left function returns characters from the left of a string. So I'm going to return characters from the left of the film title, and the number of characters I want to get is equal to the number 4. And I'm then going to ask if those leftmost 4 characters of the film title equals the word star. If I then hit enter, then I'll find any films whose first 4 characters are star. To find films that end with a particular word or particular sequence of characters, then you can do something very similar using a function called right. So let's change the left function to the right function instead and check if the result of that is equal to the 4 characters KING. If we enter that, all the films whose final 4 characters are KING. So far, every example we've created has involved just one single condition. What if we want to do something a bit more elaborate and start combining multiple conditions in the same filter function? So as a simple example, I want to return all the films whose genre is either action or adventure. To get that to work, let's modify the formula in cell A3 again, and I'm going to remove the current include argument. So right title 4 equals king, we can get rid of that entirely. Now, if you're familiar with writing if functions, you may already be familiar with some of the logical functions, such as and or. So in an if function, you could use an or function to combine multiple logical tests together, and if any single one of those logical tests returns true, then the entire thing returns true. Sadly, that doesn't work in the filter function. The way the filter function works is a little strange when you first encounter it. The idea is that we can add or multiply different logical tests together to generate or and conditions. So, to create 2 separate conditions that are treated with an or criterion or an or logical operator, in one set of round brackets, we write condition number 1, and then we add that to a second condition in another set of round brackets. This is just the basic pattern. So the plus operator there acts as an OR operator. So let's replace these words condition 1 and condition 2 with the actual logical tests. The first one, I want to check if the genre equals action. So that's one complete separate logical test in its own set of round brackets. Then I'm going to add that to genre equals adventure. So two completely separate logical tests, and if I hit enter at that point, I will return all of the films whose genre is either action or adventure. We can carry on adding more and more conditions together as well. Let's just add another one. If I edit the formula in cell A3 again, here I'm just going to quickly copy and paste plus genre equals adventure, and then paste that on at the end. And then let's change the word adventure, let's change it to fantasy, say, so we get a third genre in there as well. So hitting enter again at that point returns some more films whose genre is fantasy. When you write multiple conditions in the same filter function, they don't all have to be based on the same column. So just to demonstrate that, let's create another combination of criteria to show all the films which either have a box office of at least 2.5 billion or got nominated for at least 5 Oscars. So we can modify the formula again in cell A3, and we only need 2 conditions this time, so I'm just going to get rid of the final one there where it says genre equals fantasy. And the basic pattern is going to be the same. We write in separate sets of round brackets our 2 conditions, but let's replace the genre equals action with a condition that says box office greater than or equal to 2.5, and we'll add that one to the second condition, which will be Oscar nominations greater than or equal to 5. So having done that, if we hit enter, we'll return any films for which either of those 2 conditions are true. So we've got 2 films returned by having a box office of at least 2.5, and one of those also has at least 5 nominations, the other one doesn't. And then all of the other films have a box office of less than 2.5, but have at least 5 nominations. Combining multiple conditions with an AND operator is very similar to combining them with an OR operator, except that instead of using a plus symbol, we use a multiply symbol between the conditions instead. So let's edit the formula in cell A2 again, and this time rather than adding our 2 conditions together, we'll multiply them. So if I hit enter at this point, the only film which satisfies both criteria of having a box office of at least 2.5 and an Oscar nominations of at least 5 is this first one in the list, Avatar. You can again combine even more conditions. Let's modify the formula again. I'm going to this time check to see any films that didn't win any Oscars but did get nominated for one. So I'm going to change my first condition to check for films where the Oscar wins equals 0, but where the Oscar nominations is greater than 0. So nominated films that didn't win anything. So at that point, I'll find all the losers, basically, in my list. But now I want to restrict that to a specific genre, let's say the action genre. So we can modify the formula again, and we can just multiply yet another condition. So multiplies, and then in another set of round brackets, here I'll say genre equals action. So hitting enter now limits the list even further. The AND operator is also useful when you have a value or a column you want to find values between. So for example, let's say we wanted to find all the films that have a runtime of between 150 and 180. If I edit the formula in cell A3 again, I'm going to get rid of my third condition here. And then I'm going to change the first one to say runtime greater than or equal to 150, multiplied by runtime less than or equal to 180. So both conditions must be met in order for a result to be returned. So that's all the films with a runtime between 150 and 180. You can of course also mix and match and or operators in the same filter function, but when you do that you have to be very careful to make sure that your conditions are being evaluated in the way you expect. Just as a quick example of that, let's say we want to find any films whose genre is either action or adventure, and which won at least one Oscar. So I'm going to modify the formula in cell A3 again, and I'm going to change my first condition to check if the genre equals action. So let's refer to the genre column and then check if that's equal to the word action. And I want to combine that using an OR operator to check if the genre equals adventure. So I'll just quickly cheat here and copy and paste that one. And then just change the word action to the word adventure instead. And then I want to multiply that because I want to combine the next condition using an AND operator. I want to check that the Oscar wins is greater than 0. So let's refer to the Oscar wins column and say greater than 0. So that reads fairly straightforwardly. The genre is either action or the genre is adventure, and the Oscar wins is greater than 0. However, when I hit enter, the results we get aren't necessarily what you might expect. So we can clearly see that I've got action and adventure films in the list only. That's great. But I've also got lots of films which didn't win any Oscars at all. And the reason this happens is because of the way that our arguments, our logical tests are evaluated. The same sort of BODMAS or PEDMAS rules apply to these conditions as you expect in any combination of arithmetic in Excel. Multiplication occurs before addition. So what Excel is doing is grouping this pair of conditions together, and it's evaluating those first. So it's showing us any films whose genre is adventure and which won at least one Oscar, as well as any action films, regardless of their Oscar win status. So we need to make sure we use round brackets appropriately to group together the conditions we want to evaluate together. So what I'm going to do is wrap a set of round brackets around our two OR criteria here. So these will now be treated together. So the film genre is either action or it is adventure, and in combination, the film must have won at least one Oscar. So having done that, when I hit enter now, we'll get the actual results we want. So yes, do be careful when you're mixing and matching multiple combinations of ANDs and ORs. Use round brackets to control the order in which your conditions are evaluated. So everything we've covered with the filter function so far is, I think, pretty useful. The downside to the approach we've been taking here, though, is that every time we want to try a different set of criteria, we have to manually edit the formula. And if this was a list you were going to filter frequently using different combinations of criteria, this isn't really a valid approach. It's far more useful to set up some kind of basic user interface where you can use the values of cells to pass values to the criteria of your conditions. So that's what I've started trying to do on the criteria sheet here. I've got a set of empty cells in column B where I can either enter or select values that will then feed the filter function that I'm going to write in cell D3. So just to demonstrate how this might work, I'm going to start by setting the minimum runtime value in cell B3 to 150. And I want to write a basic formula then, a filter function in cell D3 to return all the films whose runtime is at least that value. So nothing more complicated than what we've done so far. If I just zoom in a little bit to make the code easier to read, I'm going to say equals filter, and then the array that I'm going to filter is going to be my movie list, and the include parameter is simply going to say runtime greater than or equal to, and then I want to reference the value of cell B3. So rather than hard coding the number, I can use the value entered into that cell. While I'm here, I'm also going to fill in the if empty parameter just to say no results in case we don't return anything. And if I hit enter at that point, I'm returning all the films whose runtime is at least 150. Don't really have a good date format there. These are the actual numbers of the release dates rather than the actual nicely formatted dates. But just to show that if I change the number in cell B3 now, I can get different sets of results very easily just by typing a number into a cell. One thing you have to consider if you are using cell values to feed the criteria of your filter function is what happens if you leave a cell empty. So at this point, if I head back to cell B3 and just clear the contents by pressing the delete key on my keyboard, what actually happens in this case is that I return all 50 films from my list. And the reason that happens is because the value of cell B3 is being treated essentially as 0. So all of the films in my list have a runtime of greater than 0 or greater than or equal to 0, so I get all the films returned. just while I'm here and I have all the films returned, I'm going to quickly take the opportunity to select the release date column and then just format those as short dates, just to make it a little bit easier to read. There we go, that's a bit better. Now that's all well and good, I suppose. If I leave the min runtime cell empty, then I get all the films, because I know that all of my runtimes are positive numbers. But what if I had negative numbers in my list, and what if I wanted to make sure I always returned those negative numbers as well? So, for example, let's just head back to the main list and we'll temporarily change the runtime of Avatar to -1. So if I go back to the top 50 movie sheet, change the value of cell D3 to -1, we will find when we return to our criteria sheet that Avatar is no longer displayed in the list. So what we really want to do in this case is return all the films if cell B3 is empty. To do that, we need to add another condition to our filter function. Let's just go back to the top 50 movie sheet and replace the real runtime of Avatar to 161. And then we'll edit the formula on our criteria sheet in cell D3. I'm going to wrap a set of round brackets around my first criterion, runtime greater than or equal to B3. And then I'm going to add that, so using an OR criterion, in some round brackets to ask if B3 equals an empty string, so double quotes with nothing in between. So if I hit enter at this point, I'm returning all of my films. If I enter a minimum runtime, let's say 180, then it filters the list appropriately. If I enter the value of 0, then I return all the films that have a runtime of greater than or equal to 0. And if I head back to the top 50 movie sheet and I change the runtime of Avatar back to -1, -1 is not greater than or equal to 0, of course. So if I have 0 entered into that cell, Avatar doesn't appear in the list. However, if I clear the contents of cell B3 so that it's not a 0, it's essentially treated as an empty string, I can now return all the results from the list regardless of what their runtime is. Just to wrap this section up, let's head back to the top 50 movie sheet and replace the real runtime of Avatar, 161, so that everything appears normal again. Now let's add a second option so that we can enter both a minimum and a maximum runtime and return all the films whose runtime falls within that range. To make that work, we'll edit the formula in cell D3, and I effectively want to create another pair of criteria, like the first pair, asking whether runtime is less than or equal to the value in B4, or B4 is empty. But I need to join that second pair of criteria to the first pair of criteria with an AND operator. So whenever we're mixing and matching combinations of ANDs and ORs, we need to be very careful to control the order in which these conditions are evaluated. So what I'm going to do is make sure that this first pair of conditions we've created is always treated together, so I'm going to wrap a new set of round brackets around that entire thing. And that basic pattern kind of holds true for every combination of criteria we're going to create. So at this point I'm just going to copy and paste that entire bracketed pair of conditions, and I'm going to paste it in just after a multiplies operator, so an AND operator, in the same include parameter. Let's just alter the second pair of conditions then, so we're going to go less than or equal to the value of B4, or B4 is empty. So, getting a little trickier to read at this point, but let's hit enter at this stage, and at this point I've got all the films whose runtime is between 150 and 180. If I remove the first condition, or the first value in cell B3, that returns all the films whose runtime is less than or equal to 180. If I replace the number 150 and remove the number 180, I'll get all the films whose runtime is at least 150. And if I remove both values, I'll get all the films regardless of what runtime they have. Now I'd like to go back and add in the slightly more complicated criteria so that the user can enter part of a film title in cell B2, and any films whose title contains that text will be returned in the list. So I'm going to edit the formula in cell D3 again, and I'm going to copy and paste the combination of criteria for any pair. It doesn't really matter which of the two I use here. But I'm going to go with the first one. I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to paste this on at the beginning of my include parameter. Again, it doesn't matter which order we do this in at this point. I just want to make sure that I multiply that pair of conditions with the next pair of conditions multiplied with the next pair of conditions. I'm going to change my cell reference here to ask where B2 is empty. And then inside this set of purple brackets here where I'm referencing the runtime greater than or equal to B3, I'm going to remove that entirely. So if you remember, the way we test whether a piece of text exists within another is to use the search function or the find function and wrap that up in an isNumber function to determine whether we returned a number or an error. So I'm going to say isNumber. I'm going to close the extra set of round brackets for that. Inside the isNumber function, I'm going to use the search function. So I'm going to assume I don't want it to be case sensitive. And then I'm going to close the set of round brackets for search. And inside the search function, I'm going to say find whatever text I've entered into cell B2 within the title field of my main list. So assuming I've got all the brackets in all the right places, I think I have, when I hit enter, at the moment I should still be returning all 50 films, so I should be ending up at row number 52 down there. And if I typed in a bit of text in cell B2, I could say maybe enter the word star. Any film that's got the word star in its name, change that to king. Any film with the word king in its name, enter a maximum runtime of 120, say. Then I'll find any films that have got the word king no longer than 120 minutes. So everything appears to be working pretty normally at this point. I think I'm pretty happy with the way all that works. Let's just clear the contents of all our criteria to get all of our films back again. To add in the final two options for the genre and the certificate is no more difficult than what we've done so far. In fact, probably easier than the one that we've just created for the contains text criterion. What I really wanted to do here, though, is provide a much easier way to assign the genre and the certificate. I don't want to just have to type in any old random word. I'd like to select from a predetermined list of choices, and those choices are going to be populated from the unique values of our original list. So what I'm going to do is create a brand new blank worksheet, just using the New Sheet button down here. Then I'm going to use a couple of functions we've seen in earlier videos. The unique function to return unique values from a list, and the sort function to make sure they're sorted in ascending order. So I'm going to say in cell A1 equals sort unique, and then refer to the genre field from my main table of movies. Close the appropriate number of round brackets and hit enter, and there's my list of unique genres in a spilled array. I can do basically the same thing here for the certificate list. In fact, I'm just going to fill to the right by pressing Ctrl R. So I've selected cell B1. I'm going to press Ctrl R to fill right, and then hit the F2 key to edit that formula and remove the word genre, replace it with the word certificate instead. So there we go. I've got two lists of unique values. Now I want to use those lists to populate drop-down options in the criteria sheet. I'm going to quickly change the name of sheet 1 there to say lists, or at least attempt to do that. Try again. There we go. And then in the criteria sheet, I'm going to select cell B5. Then I'm going to use data validation to control what options I'm allowed to select in this cell. So from the data tab in the ribbon, I can find and select the data validation tool. And from here, I want to choose to allow a list. And I'm going to set the source of that list to be equal to, starting in cell A1 on my lists sheet, then I can simply type in a hash symbol to reference the entire spilled array. So having done that, I can click OK, and we'll find now that whenever I have cell B5 selected, clicking on the drop-down arrow is populated with all the cells in that spilled array. I can do the same thing for the certificate cell there, cell B6, head to the data tab, choose data validation, and then allow a list whose source comes from cell B1. And again, I'm going to type in a hash symbol at the end to make sure that that includes the entire spilled array. Click OK, and now I can select a certificate as well. Finally, we can change the formula in cell D3 to take into account the two new parameter values we provided for genre and certificate. At this point, it's getting a little tricky to edit the formula in the same cell because it's such a long formula at this point. What you might prefer to do here is use the formula bar and try using a multi-row formula. So I'm just going to click and drag to change the height of my formula bar. And then just after I've created my filter function and opened up the round brackets, I'm afraid I can't zoom in on the font size in here, I'm afraid, but just after the open round brackets, I'm going to press Alt and Enter to move the movie list range name down to the next line. Then after the first comma there, I'm going to press Alt and Enter again to take my first pair of criteria. Is number search B2 title or B2 is empty? And then just after the multiply symbol, press Alt and Enter again. Find the next multiply symbol and press Alt and Enter again. And then find the next comma and press Alt and Enter again. Now, this doesn't change the way the formula behaves at all, but what it does help you do is spot where you've written the correct combinations of round brackets. So you can see the color coding, I think, is a lot easier to see, particularly if I zoom in there. Much easier to see the basic pattern that we're trying to follow. So what I'm going to do then is let's first of all add an extra multiply symbol at the end of our final current parameter, the B4 equals an empty string. And then I'm going to press Alt and Enter. Then I'm just going to go back to the previous line and I'm going to copy all of that code there and then paste it in on the next line. Let's then alter that formula or that condition so it says where the genre is equal to the value of cell B5 or B5 equals empty. Then again, if I click just before the comma at the end of that line and press Alt and Enter again, this time I'm just going to copy and paste everything up to the closed round bracket so I don't need to multiply another condition. Paste that in just before the comma and then change the word genre to the word certificate. Check if that's equal to cell B6, or check if cell B6 is empty. So the entire formula, although it's quite a long-winded one and sort of difficult to read as a single continuous line, when you break it up piece by piece like that, it can make it much easier to work with. Anyway, it's a personal preference thing, I think. I'm just going to hit enter at this point to reassure myself that the formula works. I'll just collapse the height of my formula bar again to give myself a bit more space. So at the moment, with no values filled in, I should be returning all 50 films in the list. Now I can happily choose any combination of criteria I like. Let's say I want to find all the films in the adventure genre that have a runtime of at least, let's say, 140 minutes. So I'll go for a min runtime of 140. There we go, we get one single film returned. Let's wipe out the min runtime and change the genre to action. Let's limit this. I was going to limit this to a particular certificate, but it looks like we've only got 12A certificates. Tell you what, let's get rid of the action genre and choose the certificate instead. Let's go with U certificated films. So there we've got some animation and science fiction films. I'm interested in a sci-fi film. Let's change the genre to science fiction. There we go. I'll get rid of science fiction then, and maybe let's say I want to find all the films that have got the number 3 in their title that have a U certificate. So at this point, everything should just be working nicely and intuitively using any combination of criteria you like. So there you go. There's a few examples of how to use the filter function to filter lists of data. Hope you've enjoyed that one. I think it's a fun function to use, the filter function. I'm sure you can find many uses for it. Thanks very much for watching as always, and we'll see you next time.